I am staring at a water stain on a concrete ceiling that is exactly 43 inches from my face. There are no windows in this room, just the suffocating, humid smell of raw cement and the relentless, chaotic noise of the Rocinha slum bleeding through the thin walls. Every morning I wake up, put on the same pair of stained cargo pants, and walk down the hill to unload heavy wooden crates of produce for local merchants. I do this for a few crumpled bills, just enough to buy rice, maybe some black beans, and survive another day without begging outside the supermarket. I have $0 to my name. My tourist visa expired months ago. I am completely, utterly trapped. If you had looked at my life 3 years ago, you would tell me that this outcome was statistically impossible. For 35 years, my entire existence was defined by risk mitigation. I was a corporate logistics manager for a mid-sized firm in Ohio. My job was to forecast supply chain failures before they happened. I didn't make guesses. I built predictive models. I lived by Excel spreadsheets and rigid protocols. I was the guy who created safety buffers for the safety buffers. I played by the rules, I paid my taxes, and I never, not once, let emotion dictate a financial decision. I was the definition of a rational, calculating man. You look at someone like me and you think, that guy doesn't fall for it. That guy doesn't end up destitute, thousands of miles from home, stripped of his passport and every ounce of his dignity. But the truth is, the math was never the problem. The problem was the quiet, gnawing emptiness standing right behind it. A few years ago, my wife left me. There was no massive betrayal, no dramatic fight. She just packed her bags and told me she was profoundly bored. And the worst part was, I couldn't even argue with her. We had raised 2 kids who were now independent adults, living their own lives, rarely bothering to call. I had done everything right. I was the steady provider, the reliable patriarch. But I realized, staring at that empty suburban house, that in the process of being perfectly reliable, I had become completely invisible. My youth and my prime years had been traded away to make sure the bills were paid, but I had never actually been desired or respected as an individual. I was 58 years old. My reward for a lifetime of responsible, unappreciated behavior was a silent house and a dead-end loop of expenses. I refused to accept that. I felt a desperate, quiet arrogance building inside me. I was convinced that I had played the game perfectly and was therefore owed a massive reward. I wanted a second act. I needed to prove to myself, and to my ex-wife, that I was a winner who could outsmart the mundane, suffocating reality of the American middle class. So, I made a decision. A highly calculated one. I liquidated my entire existence. I sold the house in Ohio, cashed out my 401k, and emptied every savings account I had. When the dust settled, I had exactly $650,000 in cash. In America, that's barely enough to survive a mediocre, penny-pinching retirement. But I knew how to run the numbers. I looked at the exchange rates. I looked at the map. I knew that somewhere else, that money wouldn't just buy me survival, it would buy me status, respect, and control. I thought my logic was bulletproof. I thought I held all the cards. I am speaking to you now from the damp floor of this concrete box because I need you to understand something crucial. I didn't end up here because I was stupid. I ended up here because I was lonely. And a lonely, arrogant man with a spreadsheet is the easiest mark in the world. When I first touched down in Rio de Janeiro, I felt like a master strategist who had just won a 35-year chess match. I hadn't just thrown a dart at a globe. I had studied inflation rates, healthcare infrastructure, and currency fluctuations. My nest egg, which would have condemned me to a life of pinching pennies and clipping coupons in the Midwest, made me a multi-millionaire in Brazilian reais. It was a flawless geo-arbitrage strategy. I had bypassed the system. I didn't move into a penthouse right away. That's not who I am. I rented a comfortable, mid-range Airbnb in Copacabana, just a few blocks back from the water. I wasn't there to act like a reckless tourist or a midlife crisis cliché throwing cash at bartenders. My goal was different. I wanted to establish myself as a respected, affluent expatriate. I planned to live strictly off the dividends of my investments, slowly learn the language, and control my environment with the same iron grip I used to manage corporate supply chains. For the first few months, my routine was a monument to discipline. I woke up at 6 every morning, brewed local coffee, and sat on my balcony. I spent hours updating my spreadsheets, tracking my daily expenses against the fluctuating exchange rate down to the fraction of a cent. I walked the mosaic sidewalks of the beach with my shoulders back. I felt completely validated. Every time I looked at the ocean, I felt a quiet, smug satisfaction. I had outsmarted everyone. My ex-wife was probably sitting in traffic somewhere, and I was living in a postcard. I was so fixated on the mathematics of my victory that I refused to acknowledge the echo in my apartment. I called my isolation independence. I told myself that the profound silence of my days was the peaceful retirement I had earned. But the truth is, the emotional void that drove me out of Ohio hadn't stayed there. I had packed it in my suitcase. I was 58 years old, physically healthy, and financially secure. Yet I was entirely invisible in a city overflowing with life. My children didn't call to ask how the beach was. My former colleagues didn't email to say they missed my expertise. I had built this perfectly calculated, sun-drenched fortress, but there was no one to share it with. No one to look at me and say, "You did it. You're brilliant." I didn't just want safety anymore. Safety was what I gave my youth for, and it had left me empty. I wanted a second act. I wanted to feel vibrant, powerful, and admired. I wanted an audience for my success. I thought my meticulous accounting made me bulletproof. I knew the exact price of a bottle of water at the corner store, and I knew precisely what my portfolio had yielded by noon. I believed my rationality was an impenetrable shield. But a shield only protects you from the outside. I didn't realize that when a man is quietly starving for relevance, he will eventually unlock the gates himself, just to let somebody in. The transition from a 35-year corporate career to early retirement in a foreign country is physically abrupt, but psychologically, it is a slow bleed. I had designed my life in Rio de Janeiro to be a fortress of absolute predictability. My $650,000 nest egg was securely allocated, generating enough passive yield that my meticulously updated Excel sheets always showed a green, positive variance at the end of the month. My plan was functioning exactly as engineered. But the problem with building a perfect, airtight fortress is that eventually you realize you are just a prisoner with better scenery. By month 4, the novelty of the tropical sun had burned off, leaving behind a stark, undeniable quiet. I would sit in my living room, listening to the rhythmic clicking of the ceiling fan, staring at my phone. The screen remained dark. My daughter sent a single generic text on Thanksgiving. My former deputy back at the logistics firm emailed exactly once to ask where I had saved a specific vendor file. That was the sum total of my legacy. 35 years of being the bedrock of a family and a company, and my absence barely left a ripple in the water. I felt a profound, suffocating uselessness. I was a manager with nothing left to manage. My analytical mind, however, refused to process this as an emotional crisis. I couldn't admit that I was deeply, agonizingly lonely. Instead, I framed it as a strategic inefficiency. I told myself that absolute isolation was statistically detrimental to my long-term cognitive health. I rationalized that if my goal was to be a respected expatriate, sitting alone in an Airbnb was a failure to execute the cultural integration phase of my retirement plan. I decided my strategy needed an adjustment. I needed a new routine, a public space where I could exist, observe, and, most importantly, be perceived as the man I believed I was. But I wasn't going to be reckless. I was Arthur Pendleton. I was entirely above the desperate midlife crisis cliches. I wasn't going to wander into loud tourist bars or linger around the beaches looking for company. I calculated the safest, most respectable environment to spend my afternoons. I found it in an upscale bookstore cafe in Ipanema. It was a beautiful, climate-controlled sanctuary with imported oak tables, walls lined with international literature, and soft jazz playing in the background. The clientele consisted of affluent locals, university students, and serious professionals. It felt safe. It felt like an environment I could control. Every day at precisely 2 p.m., I would walk in, order a double espresso, and sit at the exact same table near the window. I would open a hardcover biography or a copy of the Financial Times, adjust my reading glasses, and make a quiet show of being a sophisticated, intellectual expat. I thought I was projecting strength, worldly experience, and quiet wealth. I convinced myself that this new routine was a masterstroke of balanced living. Looking back from this concrete floor, I know exactly what I was actually projecting. I was a man wearing an invisible neon sign that said, "I have money, I have zero connections, and I am desperate for someone to ask me a question." I believed I was expanding my portfolio of life experiences in a highly secure environment. In reality, I had just walked out of my fortress, placed myself neatly on a shelf, and sat there, waiting for someone to walk by and appraise my exact value. It happened on a Tuesday. I had been sitting at my usual table in the bookstore cafe for about an hour, dissecting an article on emerging market yields, when my reading glasses slipped from the polished oak table and clattered onto the floor. Before I could bend down, a hand reached down and picked them up. "The hinges on these titanium frames always get loose in the humidity," a voice said. Flawless, unaccented English. I looked up and saw Mariana. If you have never been an older, lonely man in a foreign country, you probably have a very specific image in your head of how this works. You picture a woman in a tight dress, reeking of cheap perfume, laughing too loudly at bad jokes, aggressively signaling her availability. You picture a transaction. I knew that stereotype. I had built mental firewalls against it. Mariana dismantled those firewalls by simply not matching the profile. She was 28, dressed conservatively in a linen blouse and tailored trousers. She didn't look at my watch or the expensive leather folio on my table. She told me she was an architecture student, working part-time at a local design firm, and had simply stopped in for a coffee between classes. She sat at the table next to mine, and we started talking. Or rather, I started talking, and she did something nobody had done in 35 years. She actively, intensely listened. When she asked what I did before moving to Rio, I gave her my usual self-deprecating summary. Just boring corporate logistics, moving boxes from point A to point B on a spreadsheet. Mariana shook her head, leaning in slightly. That's not boring. That's the entire invisible nervous system of the world. You were predicting chaos before it happened. That requires a specific kind of architectural mind. I cannot overstate the intoxicating power of that moment. My ex-wife used to roll her eyes when I talked about supply chain efficiency. My kids thought my career was a punchline, but here was this intelligent, beautiful woman, looking at me as if I possessed a rare and fascinating intellect. She didn't see a tired retiree. She saw a visionary. When the waiter brought our checks, I naturally reached for hers. It was a reflex, a minor flex of my financial security. She immediately put her hand over mine, her expression turning serious. "Arthur, please," she said. "I work for my money. I can pay for my own coffee." That was the hook. That single 20 real coffee bill was the most expensive investment I ever made, because it bought my complete, unquestioning trust. My analytical brain registered the data point and spat out a conclusion. She is not after my money. She is independent. Over the next 2 months, the relationship progressed with a slow, deliberate grace that completely disarmed me. There was no rushed intimacy, no chaotic nights at expensive clubs. Instead, she took me to quiet historical museums in Centro, to forgotten colonial churches, to small family-run restaurants hidden in the hills. I felt like I was being slowly integrated into the real Brazil, guided by someone who appreciated history, stability, and intellect. The validation was intoxicating. I remember trying to buy her a gift for her birthday, a tasteful, moderately expensive designer watch I spotted in a Leblon boutique. When I presented the box to her, she didn't smile. She actually looked deeply offended. She pushed it back across the table, her eyes welling up. "I am not a woman you can buy, Arthur," she told me, her voice trembling with what I swore was genuine hurt. "If you think I'm spending time with you for things like this, you don't understand me at all." I spent the next 3 days apologizing. I felt ashamed of my clumsy American materialism. To make it up to me, she insisted on coming to my Airbnb that weekend. She brought bags of groceries she had bought herself and spent the afternoon cooking a traditional moqueca in my kitchen, explaining that she wanted to show me how to live beautifully without wasting my savings. I sat at my dining table, smelling the coconut milk and dende oil, watching her move gracefully around my kitchen, and I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of victory. I looked at the situation through the lens of a corporate strategist. I had analyzed the variables. She refused expensive gifts. She paid her own way. She cooked for me to save my money. She was fascinated by my mind. I concluded, with absolute certainty, that I had found a unicorn. A traditional, family-oriented woman who recognized my true value. Fraud is not an event. It is a slow, methodical process of voluntary blindness. By our 4th month together, Mariana had seamlessly integrated into my life. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was the axis around which my entire routine revolved. And because I felt so thoroughly in control of the situation, I was completely unprepared when the first actual test arrived. It happened on a Friday evening. She came over to my apartment, but she was unusually quiet. Her eyes were slightly red, though she wasn't crying. She sat at my dining table, pulled her laptop from her bag, and began meticulously wiping down the screen. Then, she took out her phone and started taking photos of it from different angles. I asked her what she was doing. She didn't look up. She kept her voice flat, almost clinical, and explained that she was listing her computer for sale. Her younger sister, who lived in a small, rural town in Minas Gerais, had been admitted to a local clinic with a severe abdominal infection. The public hospital queue was days long, and the private clinic required an immediate cash deposit for the surgery. She didn't ask me for a dime. She simply stated the facts, packed up the computer she supposedly needed for her architecture degree, and prepared to sacrifice her own future for her family. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, tailored specifically to my psychological profile. If she had wept, or panicked, or begged me for cash, my corporate defenses would have instantly locked down. I would have recognized the pattern. But her stoicism triggered something far more dangerous inside me, the desperate need to be a savior. I told her to put the laptop away. I asked how much the deposit was. $3,000, she said, looking down at her hands, visibly ashamed. I logged into my brokerage account right there at the table and initiated the transfer. It was a fraction of a percent of my portfolio. To me, it was a rounding error. To her, it was life-altering. The look of absolute awe and tearful gratitude she gave me that night cemented everything I wanted to believe about myself. I wasn't just a retired logistics manager anymore. I was a patriarch. I was a man of power and consequence. To satisfy my analytical mind, I opened my master Excel spreadsheet. I created a new cell and typed, "Emergency Medical, Mariana, $3,000. I categorized it. I highlighted it in yellow. I told myself that because I was documenting the outflow, I was managing the risk. I fundamentally confused data entry with due diligence. Once that first boundary was breached, the anomalies started appearing. But I had already built the cognitive framework to excuse them. Take her university schedule, for instance. It was a ghost. In all our time together, I never once drove her to a specific campus building. I never met a single classmate. There were no study groups, no textbooks left on my coffee table. When I casually asked about it, she gave vague answers about independent studio hours and remote design modules. A rational man would have driven to the university and checked her enrollment. But I didn't want to be a rational man anymore. I wanted to be a loved man. I told myself that her isolation was just a byproduct of her intense dedication to her studies and, more importantly, to me. I flattered myself into believing I occupied so much of her world that there simply wasn't room for anyone else. But reality has a way of trying to warn you, even when you plug your ears. A few weeks later, I was at an Irish pub in Copacabana waiting for Mariana to finish a client meeting. I struck up a conversation with a guy named Frank, an American ex-military contractor who had been living in Rio for a decade. Frank was loud, sweaty, and deeply cynical. I disliked him immediately. In a moment of arrogant pride, I found myself telling him about Mariana. I made sure to emphasize how different she was from the stereotypes, how she was an educated professional, how she refused my gifts. Frank stopped drinking. He set his pint glass down, wiped his mouth, and looked at me with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "Arthur," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "The girls on the street, they take $100 in your watch. That's honest theft. But the educated ones? The ones in the nice blouses who won't let you buy them a drink? They're running a completely different calculus. They are playing a multi-year-long con. They don't want your watch. They wait until you're completely asleep at the wheel, and then they take the whole damn house." I felt a hot flush of anger in my chest. I looked at Frank's stained collar, his cheap beer, and his bitter, bloodshot eyes. I didn't see a warning, I saw a failure. I saw a man who had never possessed the intellect or the value to attract a woman of substance, and who was projecting his own miserable experiences onto my success. "My situation is different, Frank," I replied coldly, tossing a 20-real bill on the bar and walking out. I walked back to my apartment, completely secure in my own arrogance. I had 35 years of corporate risk assessment behind me. I had an airtight spreadsheet. I was Arthur Pendleton, and I was in absolute control. I didn't realize that the only thing I was successfully managing was the exact pace of my own destruction. By our second year, the Airbnb in Copacabana had started to feel small, and Mariana had successfully convinced me that renting was a mathematically terrible decision. She was right, of course. That was the brilliance of her approach. Every step she proposed was grounded in solid financial logic. Before we even started looking at properties, Mariana began subtly pruning my social life. It wasn't a sudden demand that I stop seeing people. It was a series of gentle, concerned observations. If I mentioned getting a beer with one of the American expats I had met, she would sigh softly and mention how disrespectful they were to the local culture, or how she felt uncomfortable around them. Without realizing it, I found myself getting defensive on her behalf. I started minor, unnecessary arguments with the few English-speaking acquaintances I had, effectively cutting ties with any outside voices of reason. I was entirely isolated, existing inside an echo chamber where Mariana's voice was the only one I heard. And her voice was telling me that we were ready to build an empire. We found a luxury penthouse in Leblon a few weeks later. It was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows, imported marble countertops, and a wraparound terrace that looked out over the Atlantic. The asking price was the equivalent of $450,000. In Ohio, that might buy a nice 4-bedroom house in a good school district. Here, it bought prestige. There was just one logistical hurdle. As a foreigner on a rolling tourist visa, buying property outright in Brazil involved a labyrinth of bureaucratic taxes, heavy international transfer fees, and endless delays. Mariana sat me down at the dining table with a pad of paper, mapping out the tax liabilities just like I used to map out supply chain routes. If we put the deed in my name temporarily, she explained, tracing her pen over the paper, we bypass the foreign buyer's tax entirely. Once your permanent residency is approved, we transfer it to a joint trust. It saves us nearly $60,000, Arthur. It made perfect sense. I was a man who hated inefficiency, and paying a massive penalty to a foreign government felt like a failure. Furthermore, my permanent residency was already being handled. Mariana had introduced me to her cousin, Tiago, a sharply dressed, fast-talking local investment broker. Tiago had laid out a flawless path to a permanent investor visa. I just needed to invest $100,000 into an active Brazilian company. Because of my background, Tiago found the perfect opportunity: a mid-sized local logistics business looking for a silent partner. I was staring down the barrel of my ultimate fantasy: an international property owner, a business investor, a beautiful, devoted partner. All the pieces were locking into place. I logged into my American brokerage accounts. I didn't hesitate. I didn't run a secondary risk assessment. I liquidated $550,000. I wired $450,000 directly to buy the luxury apartment entirely in Mariana's name. Then, I wired an additional $100,000 to Tiago to purchase the local business for my visa application. It was the point of absolutely no return. I had just handed over the vast majority of my net worth. But as I clicked the confirmation button on the transfers, I didn't feel fear. I felt a massive, rushing wave of adrenaline and triumph. I had finally executed the masterstroke. The validation came almost immediately, cementing my delusion completely. 2 weeks later, we moved into the penthouse. Mariana organized a lavish housewarming party. The apartment was filled with her friends, elegantly dressed young professionals, architects, and artists. She held my arm the entire night, introducing me to a wide circle of acquaintances, not as her older American boyfriend, but as her brilliant, visionary husband. I stood on that marble terrace, holding a glass of expensive imported wine, looking out over the glittering coastline, surrounded by people who looked at me with genuine respect and awe. The next morning, Tiago came over for espresso. He handed me a heavy, leather-bound folder. Inside were the official incorporation documents for the logistics business, stamped and notarized with government seals showing the purchase was complete. He also brought the first month's financial projections. The business was already generating a 5% monthly return. "You did it, my friend," Tiago said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You are officially a Brazilian magnate." I felt entirely invincible. The quiet, gnawing emptiness that had chased me out of Ohio was completely gone, replaced by a concrete reality of wealth and status. I was so secure in my victory that, for the first time in 35 years, I stopped tracking the numbers. I didn't open my Excel spreadsheet once that month. I didn't need to. I had won the game. I was Arthur Pendleton, and I had finally gotten exactly what I deserved. The illusion held perfectly until year 2, month 8. That was when I finally decided to pull a single thread. I wanted to book a brief trip back to Ohio. I didn't actually want to see my ex-wife or my children, but I wanted them to see me. I wanted to fly first class, step off the plane in a tailored Italian suit, and let them witness the wealthy, cosmopolitan man I had become. To fund the trip, I decided to draw a small dividend from my logistics business. I sat down at my laptop and typed in the banking portal credentials Tiago had provided. The screen returned a sterile, gray error message. Invalid account. I called Tiago's cell phone. The automated voice of the local carrier told me the number was disconnected. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. But 35 years of corporate conditioning kicked in. I didn't panic. I told myself it was a clerical error, a server migration, a simple miscommunication. I put on my shoes, walked out of the penthouse, and took a taxi to the industrial district in Zona Norte, directly to the address printed on my stamped, notarized incorporation documents. I found a warehouse, but there were no delivery trucks, no dispatchers, no hum of commerce. There was only a rusted, corrugated metal gate, secured by a thick chain covered in years of undisturbed grime. The roof had partially caved in. The building had clearly been abandoned for a decade. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. I yelled at the taxi driver to take me back to Leblanc. When the elevator doors opened to my floor, I found the front door of the penthouse unlocked. I burst inside and found Mariana in the master bedroom, frantically throwing clothes into 2 large suitcases. Her face was streaked with tears. When she saw me, she collapsed against the edge of the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. It was a flawless, visceral performance. "Tiago ruined us," she choked out, barely able to catch her breath. "He took everything from the business. The federal police are looking for him, Arthur. He's involved with terrible people. I have to go. I have to hide, or they'll come for us." She zipped her suitcases, kissed me on the cheek, and told me to lay low. She walked out the door, promising she would call me as soon as it was safe. I stood in the center of the marble living room for 3 hours, staring at the Atlantic Ocean, completely paralyzed. Then, I walked to the local civil police station. The detective was a heavy-set man who smelled of stale tobacco and cheap floor cleaner. He didn't look at me with pity. He just looked deeply, profoundly tired. I handed him my leather-bound folder. He glanced at the documents for less than 10 seconds before sliding them back across the metal desk. "The stamps are fake," he said in broken English. "This CNPJ, the tax number, belongs to a bakery that closed in 2014. There is no business. And this man, Tiago, that is not his real name." I tried to swallow, but my throat was bone dry. "The apartment," I whispered. "The penthouse. We bought it together. It's in her name, but I have the wire transfers." The detective typed something into his terminal. He sighed. "She sold the apartment, senor, 3 days ago, to a cash buyer. You have no legal claim to this property. You were just a tourist who gave a Brazilian citizen a very large gift." I walked to an ATM on the corner of the street and inserted the debit card for the joint account Mariana and I had opened. The screen loaded, and the balance appeared in bright, neon green pixels. Zero. $650,000. The cumulative result of 35 years of waking up in the dark, driving through Ohio snowstorms, sitting in windowless conference rooms, and denying myself every indulgence. Gone. The housewarming party, the admiring friends, the architecture degree, the sick sister in Minas Gerais. It was all a meticulously engineered theatrical production, and I was the only paying audience member. Within 48 hours, the new owner of the penthouse arrived with a locksmith. I was handed a trash bag to pack whatever clothes I had left, and was escorted out of the lobby by private security. People always ask the same logical questions when they hear a story like this. Why didn't you go to the American consulate? Why didn't you call your children for a plane ticket home? They ask because they don't understand the physical paralysis of absolute, crushing shame. To call my daughter, to hear the silence on the other end of the line, and to admit that her father, the cold, calculating, arrogant man who thought he was smarter than everyone, had been gutted by a textbook scam? It was impossible. My ego had been the foundation of my entire existence. Stripped of it, I had no identity left to return to. I preferred to disappear. So, I let my tourist visa expire. I walked away from the affluent neighborhoods. I kept walking until the asphalt turned to dirt, and the luxury high-rises gave way to the sprawling, stacked brick labyrinths of the favela. And that brings me back to this room, to the water stain on the ceiling. Every joint in my body aches from carrying crates of rotting papayas and bruised bananas up the steep, narrow alleys of Rocinha. My hands, which used to type on ergonomic keyboards and sign corporate authorizations, are now calloused, split, and permanently stained with dirt. I am 58 years old, and I am waiting to die in a country that doesn't know I exist. The strangest part is that I don't hate Mariana. I don't curse her when I lay in the dark. Mariana was just a predator, and predators only do what nature designed them to do. They look for the weak, the separated, and the exposed. She didn't use a weapon. She didn't hack my bank accounts. She simply looked at a lonely, aging man and handed him the exact script he desperately wanted to read. I used to believe that logic and mathematics were an impenetrable shield. But I know now that the most dangerous lie in the world is the one you tell yourself. I was so terrified of being irrelevant, so desperate to prove that my life meant something, that I voluntarily dismantled every defense I had. I ran the numbers perfectly. I just forgot to account for the fatal cost of my own pride.